Welcome to episode 1 of Talking Prisoner Presents. Today we are not talking prisoner, but we are talking to a legendary newsreader who on the date of his retirement was the longest serving face on Australian TV with a media career spanning 6 decades. He was the main presenter of Melbourne's 7 national news from 1978 to 1987 and 10 eyewitness news from 1987 until 2013. He was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Quilla by the Melbourne Press Club by former Victorian Premier Dennis Napthine. He is the author of 5 books. He has written an autobiography called The Newsman. He is a legend of Australia TV and the man we all trusted to bring the news into our lounge rooms each night. We are speaking to Mal Walden. Welcome to Talking Prisoner Presents, Mal. And good morning, Ken.
Well, I'm very honoured by that introduction. Thank you very much indeed. Was that really me?
Hi, Mal. Great to see you again.
Good to see you too, Ken.
Now, before we start with your amazing life, were you ever a fan of Prisoner and watched Prisoner?
Well, I watched Prisoner. It was very interesting because in 1979, I had taken over from Brian Naylor over at Channel 7 when Nails left to go over to GTV9. And it was an interesting concept because I was suddenly thrown into a very competitive part of the television industry. There was not much competition coming from Channel O at that stage. So my concentration was basically with Channel 9. But then Rupert Murdoch took over the controlling interest of the 10 network. And then things began to change. Bruce Mansfield and Annette Allison relaunched their 1-hour news at 6 o'clock, which was a very important point of difference. And then, of course, they launched a concerted drive into drama, and this is where Prisoner came into it. So yes, I did watch Prisoner with great interest, but I didn't watch it every night, but I certainly took an interest in what was happening over at ATV.
Fantastic.
Before we speak about your career, Mal, can we learn a little about your life growing up? Where did you grow up as a child? And can you tell us the story about you being born on the 20th of May, 1943 and the 20th of March, 1945?
I was born twice. I'm quite unique, aren't I? Oh, the perception of television. I was born in the UK and we migrated to Australia in 1952. I was 9 when we arrived, and we arrived at Frankston, which was a 1-horse town, really. No, come to think of it, it was a 2-horse town. 1 horse delivered the ice blocks for our ice chest because we didn't have a fridge. The other horse delivered the milk. And I grew up in a great atmosphere of, I look back on my childhood memories in the UK, and everything is in sort of black and white and sepia. But I look back at my childhood memories when we arrived in Australia and everything is in vivid colour. So that gives you an indication of what the perception of childhood memories, I suppose. My family were a very loving family. I was born in 1943, and this is where there's a little bit of conjecture about how old I was. I was 9 when we arrived. Born in 43, but when I got into television, and particularly television news, when I took over from Nails in 79, I was considered to be too young. I was in my 30s, late 30s, but they felt that, and I also looked very young. So the biographies, the publicity department increased my age by a couple of years. Now that was okay, but the irony was, years and years later, when I was at Channel 10, and 10 were going after a young demographic, a guy in his 60s didn't suit that youth demographic, so they downgraded my age. Now, the only people that were really upset about that were my parents, but the other person that noticed it was Robert Fidgen, the TV critic, who wrote, "Some people use Botox for youth. Walden uses biogs." In fact, it was all with certain amount of amusement, but basically it was only a couple of years either way anyway, so it didn't really matter.
So you don't celebrate 2 birthdays each year?
I don't celebrate 2 years. 20th of May, 1943.
Wow. And what did your parents do for a living when you were a child? Because I know your dad was the promoter of the Polaroid camera at the time.
Yeah, I should have brought it down. I've got it in the cupboard here. Dad got a transfer to Warrnambool in the Western District in his job at the time, but it didn't suit him, didn't work out. We all moved down to Warrnambool, and that is where I completed my schooling. And during that period of time, I was interested in radio, but more so the building of radios, crystal sets and 1-valve units, tinkering with cat's whiskers. Now, that won't mean a thing to people today, but it was quite important to me in those days. And one particular night I was listening, I was supposed to be picking up air traffic from planes flying from Melbourne to Adelaide across Warrnambool. And instead it picked up the local radio station, 3YB, and they were conducting a secret sound competition. And I entered that secret sound competition because I recognized the sound of shaking water in a balloon. I'd been to a party the day before and we'd done exactly that. Shook water in a balloon and then threw it at passing cars, which you do when you're bored and living in the Western District. So I entered the competition and I won. And I won an amazing prize of £40. The following day at school, during the lunch break, I went into the radio station to pick up my check. And it was a defining moment in my life, because as the manager showed me around the radio station, I suddenly realized this is what I wanted to be. I wanted to get into radio. And that night, my father told me that things hadn't worked out in his job and we were going back to Melbourne. He'd taken over a position to promote a brand new camera on the market called a Polaroid, which developed its own picture. Now, in the course of doing that, he did a lot of advertorial television commercials. He was one of the first to do them. And one of the first networks he approached was Channel 7. And he became a household name on the Tarak show with Happy Hammond. He was known as Roly-Poly from the Polaroid, taking happy snaps of the kids in the crowd, in the audience. And he became very good friends with the gang at that time, Happy Hammond, Princess Panda, Funny Face Gordon, and one or two others. And he mentioned that he had a son that was interested in broadcasting or in radio. And so I went in and they suggested, why don't I consider doing radio announcing? So I took a course in radio announcing with a guy by the name of Lee Murray. And it was an 18-month course. And at the end of that course, I applied for a job with the ABS network. And that night they rang to say that I'd been successful, the job was mine, and I was to start at 3YB Warrnambool, which is where I won the secret sound competition, which paid £40 was the cost of my course, which paid for the course. It was fate. I can only look upon it as fate. So I started my career at the station where I won the secret sound competition.
Wow. That's an amazing story.
Speaking of school, what were you like at school, and did you have any favourite subjects or any subjects that you didn't like?
I was a struggler. I was not the brightest globe in the class. I was afflicted by shyness, basically, and not only that, but I blushed. And I'm not talking about a reddening of the cheeks. I'm talking about a full facial hemorrhage. And I would do anything to avoid drawing attention to myself, which is strange considering the career I chose later on in life. But one thing I noticed when I got into radio, no one could see me blush. And so it was a hidden affliction, if you like, that I overcame because no one could see it. And that built the confidence over the years in broadcasting, where it made it much easier to make the transition into television.
Wow. Just going back to Lee Murray for a minute. So he had the radio school, was that right? Because it was a very successful radio school where he taught people.
Oh yeah, very successful. Philip Brady was going there at the time. There were so many broadcasters that I became very friendly with in the course of that 18 months that I was going to Lee. Oh no, he trained a lot of people, a lot of announcers. His theory was project forward and to the tip of the tongue. And every broadcaster that came out of Lee Murray sounded like a BBC broadcaster. But that changed, of course, over the years. But that's how it all started.
Fantastic. Do you like to cook in your spare time? you ever see anything?
Cook?
Yeah.
No, not really. I was very lucky. I married a cordon bleu chef. Well, you know, I tell her that. She's a great cook. My wife, Pauline. No, in my youth, in my years as a bachelor, and I got to tell you, there were a few years of my bachelorhood because I didn't get married until I was 40. So my main source of cooking was tuna mornay. I mean, tuna mornay, morning, evening, and night. Every time I invited someone for dinner, it was tuna mornay. It became a specialty in that. We don't have that now. No, my wife cooks. We have a very selective diet of chicken, fish, pastas, a healthy diet. That's what's kept me youthful. My wife and her cooking.
Well, you still look really young, so it's doing something.
Peter Pan, they call me. Well, externally, internally is a different story.
Now, you have a love of gardening, fishing and family. Do you have any other hobbies at all?
Well, no, I don't have hobbies. I used to play golf, but I'm terrible at golf. So I gave that away. My time now, well, the last 2 years has been spent just sitting, reading and writing. But we're blessed with two gorgeous, adorable grandchildren. I mean, all grandparents say that, don't they? But they live close by, so we see a lot of them. I have a great garden. Considering we live in an apartment, I have a large garden, which I can maintain quite easily. And the time spent with the kids, gardening and reading and writing, they're kind of my hobbies.
Fantastic. Do you have a favorite movie or TV show that you like to watch?
I'm pretty eclectic when it comes to watching TV. I'll watch everything from Married at First Sight to, you know, the news.
You're a maths.
What's that?
You're a maths viewer.
I'm prepared to watch. And if I don't like a particular show, we diverse. But I've learned binge viewing. I don't know whether you know the term binge viewing. Streaming programs on Amazon and Netflix and what have you, Stan. So we do a lot of that. We avoid free-to-air television quite a bit. If I was to give you an idea of what we watch, I always watch Eddie's Millionaire. About 5:15 I tune in. 6 o'clock I watch Peter Hitchner read the news. 6:30 I watch The Project. Although I'm getting a little tired of the predictable, contrived humor on Project. So I hope they can reboot that in the new year. And then at the ABC, we switch over at 7 o'clock. Then, of course, we go into streaming. Lately, and when you look back, you ask me what I watch. Streaming-wise, it tends to blur. But just lately, we watched Dope Sick. You know the
yes,
the opioid crisis in the United States. Yellowstone, love Yellowstone. The ABC have done some good dramas lately. I watched The Newsreader, but I enjoyed more the following program, Fireys. So yeah, as I say, we're pretty eclectic TV viewers.
What do you think of The Newsreader?
Yes, I was asked to write a review of that. I was reluctant to watch it to begin with because I felt I have lived through it all. Why would I want to see a reenactment? But the reenactments were very good, and they were quite truthful and to the point. And I realized that a lot of the roles that were played were amalgams of a number of people, but I recognize a lot of those people. I enjoyed it, but it was not the best thing I've ever seen.
Okay.
It's very subjective. It's up there as one of the best the ABC have produced. And it was very well produced, but it just didn't appeal to me because I've been there, done that.
Yeah, true.
Did you actually have any other jobs before you went into radio straight out of school?
Yeah, I did. As a matter of fact, when I was at school, my part-time job, Saturday mornings and occasionally after school, I worked as a pump jockey at a service station, Bow Repairs in Frankston, filling cars, checking tires. And then when I actually left school, my first job was at J.C. Williamson Theatres, and I was the office boy to the head of JCW, Sir Frank Tate. I would lick his stamps and take the proceeds of the previous night's takings from Her Majesty's and the Comedy to the bank. So I was office boy at J.C. Williams for 18 months while I was doing my course with Lee Murray, which was just around the corner. So it was all very convenient.
Wow. Pump jockey. Now, no one would probably know what that is at the moment. Because, I mean,
no, that's right.
So when I was a child, yeah, you parked your car and then someone came and filled it up for you. You didn't have to leave.
That was me. That was me as a 16-year-old.
That's great. Now you
check your tires, check the oil and battery and fill the tank. Yeah.
Do the windows and
yeah, all that. Yeah.
Now you brought up the project and watching Peter Hitchener before. I'd like to ask, what do you think of where the news has gone now with shows like The Project and The Current Affair and the news bulletins? Has it changed a lot for the better or the worse?
It has changed. In some ways, it has changed dramatically. In other ways, it's not changed at all. When you actually analyze it, newsreader sits up there, sells the story, throws to the reporter to tell the story, to explain what's happened. That hasn't changed very much at all. What has changed is the technology that has allowed that to happen. When I started, we went from typewriters to computers, we went from coaxial cable to satellites, and now we've entered the digital age, and there's so many different platforms from news. News is now 24/7. Yeah. It's streaming the whole time. So that has changed. The technology has been the driving force that has dictated how news is seen. But basically, it hasn't changed. I mean, when you look at the three different channels, they're the same stories every night. You've got a newsreader sitting up there introducing the stories. The stories are pretty much the same sort of stories that I was reading about back in 1961. Certain things have not changed at all.
I have to ask, when you are watching a bulletin, do you ever miss it?
Do I miss reading it?
Yeah.
Not at all. Not at all. I know, not at all, particularly in this day and age. Now I've become very critical and I get very angry. And my wife says, just calm down. You're not doing it anymore. I said, I know, but look what they've done. Look at the way they've led with that story. Should never have led with that story. And I sit there and I become an armchair critic. I'm the worst. And I think to myself, I wonder what the people thought that when I was reading the news. Maybe they did. Anyway, yeah, I'm a critic. And as I said, I like what I watch, but I'm quite prepared to change if I get bored with it.
Yeah.
I have something in common with you, it seems. I was also Channel 7's messenger boy, mailroom clerk for 18 months or so as well.
What years, Ken?
1961.
Okay.
Yeah, 1961.
Then you'd know my very good friend Gordon Bennett.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
There is a very interesting story which has to do with myself and Maria, my wife, being lost up in the Grampians or being stranded up in the Grampians. And I think Gordon was one of the two reporters that was sent up to, this was in about 1967 or 68, to do the story on us. We were stuck in the Victoria Valley and we couldn't get out until they found us. But it's a long story, but I won't go into it now.
Well, you made it, obviously.
Yes, we survived. Doing a bit of research on Warrnambool, 3YB FM, I noticed that it's one of the most unusual histories of any Australian radio station, having commenced broadcasting in 1931 as a mobile station prior to permanently settling in Warrnambool in 1935. You lived in Warrnambool, of course, when you were young at that time. So you began as a cadet journalist for
3YB? Yeah. Actually, I think they called it a junior announcer. I headed off down there in June. Everything happens to me in June. And everything happens to me on June the 6th. I started my career at 3YB Warrnambool on June the 6th. I went to 70X Launceston, starting there on June the 6th. I left Launceston and went to join 3DB in 1966. Started 6th of June, 1966. I came back from overseas and I joined Channel 7, 6th of June, 1970. Everything happens to me on the 6th of June. So when the 6th of June starts rolling towards me, I think, what the hell's going to happen? Something good or something bad? But yeah, so June the 6th, 3YB Warrnambool, that's where I got my first break.
Wow.
And I must admit, the first big break and another defining moment happened in November 1963 while I was doing the breakfast show on 3YB. I was sitting behind the microphone and it was about 6:15 when in walked the newspaper boy, and he would deliver the Warrnambool Standard, from which I would circle stories and read a local news service from the newspaper a little later in the breakfast show. And this particular morning would have a little bit of a rapport each morning he'd come in. And I asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Have you heard Kennedy's dead?" And I said, I switched off the microphone. I said, "You can't say that," believing that if Graham Kennedy had died, it would take more than a 14-year-old newspaper boy to break the news. So I switched the microphone back on and he said, "It's true. The President of the United States has been shot." He'd heard it on 3UZ, which was quite remarkable because the signal from Melbourne was intermittent and very rarely could you hear any radio stations from Melbourne down at Warrnambool. So that was the end of our conversation. I rang my boss. He in turn rang his chief engineer, who happened to be a radio ham operator. His name was Harry Fuller. And Harry rigged up Voice of America through shortwave, patched it through to the station, and I was given carte blanche to put to air what I deemed appropriate. So we became one of the first stations in Australia to broadcast live the events that were unfolding in Dallas, Texas on that Saturday morning. And the adrenaline rush I got from breaking that news story was an addiction that would last a lifetime. I had no idea that that was the actual turning point. A few years later, when man landed on the moon and I was at 3DB, that was the next big story. And it transpired that I remembered watching the president speak to the astronauts on the moon via telephone. And while, you know, Armstrong made his great giant leap for mankind, I was more impressed that you could actually talk to someone that far away on the telephone after having come through an era where static and shortwave interference made it almost impossible to hear anything. And here he was talking to the men on the moon via telephone from the Oval Office in the White House. And it was all done via satellite. And of course, I then realized that if there was any future in news, it was not so much radio, it had to be television. And that was another little defining moment in my career.
So going back to Kennedy for a second, that all started from a newspaper boy, bringing in the newspaper.
A 14-year-old newspaper boy, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. We broke every rule in the Broadcasting Control Handbook by broadcasting through shortwave on Australian radio, but no one ever picked it up, and no one ever criticised it. We never got into trouble, but it was a first.
That's brilliant. Now, after you worked at 3DB, you moved to the sister station HSV7 in early 1970 as a reporter. So how did you get the job at Channel 7? And what was it like to be a reporter in the 70s?
Well, shortly after...
Why did you spray your hair as well?
Okay, well, there's a few questions in that, and I'll see if I can trace that through. In '69, I left 3DB and went to the Middle East. And I worked on a kibbutz in Israel, filing stories of events in the Middle East to Gerald Lyons, who was conducting a talkback radio show on 3DB. So when I came back from the Middle East, in that short time, or that 12 months I was away, my very good friend Ron Casey had become station manager at Channel 7. I worked with Ron at 3DB. And so on the basis of it's not what you know, it's who you know, I approached Ron Casey for a job when I arrived back from Israel. And he said, look, I'll hire you tonight as a booth announcer. And I said, what about news? And he said, oh, that's a hard nut to crack, son. But if you join us, at least you've got a foot in the door should any opportunities come your way. Well, that night I started as a booth announcer, June the 6th, 1970. At about 9:45, the late night newsreader was taken seriously ill, and I was forced to read the late news.
Wow.
Not knowing that I would then go on to read the news for the next 43 years on Melbourne television. Right place, right time, not so much what you know, but who you know. All came together, June the 6th.
That's amazing.
So what were the other questions? Why did I change the color of my the hair color? Was
Your hair, yeah. What? They
Yeah.
forced you to spray your hair. Was that right?
Well, they did. Casey was very conscious of perception and image. And the fact that he said I was well qualified to become a newsreader. I was young, so they fixed my age. And we don't like your hair. It's too red. We think it's a distraction. So they sprayed it a little bit darker each night. But every night there was a different makeup artist on. So every night it was a slightly different shade. And again, Robert Fidgen was the only one that picked it up. And he did a cartoon with red, blue, yellow, green. And there I was sitting with all colored hair. But that didn't last long. It only lasted a couple of weeks. And then it was just let nature take its course.
When you're at 7, was that when Christopher Skase owned it or not?
No. Now you're getting into heavy water here. We were owned by the Herald and Weekly Times.
Okay.
It was part of the stable of 3DB and Channel 7. We were in a network situation with ATN in Sydney, but by name only. We weren't financially controlled. They would share programs and they would share costs occasionally with a lot of arguing. So there were a lot of debts to be settled when Fairfax took over Channel 7 in Melbourne. Okay. You might remember, you wanted to go into that stage of my career now?
We will soon.
Okay, yeah, okay. I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay.
In 1978, you became the first working journalist appointed and chief news presenter at Channel 7, replacing Brian Naylor, who we will talk about shortly. Can you tell us what was it like to become chief news presenter and some behind the scenes stories about your mentor, John Marr? I remember.
Yeah. Happy to talk about John and happy to tell you what happened. Where do I actually start with this? John Marr was my mentor in news at Channel 7. He was an irascible, hard-nosed, hard-driving, take-no-prisoner sort of a guy, not unlike Bill McInnes in the newsreader. In fact, I think that was partly modelled on John Marr and John Sorrell from Channel 9. And I think, frankly, Sorrell modelled himself on John Marr. Such was the character of Marr. Marr discovered and mentored the very first newsreader on Melbourne television, Eric Pearce. And when Eric Pearce was unceremoniously sacked, which is not generally known, he was sacked in 1958 by the head of the Herald and Weekly Times. When he went and eventually joined Channel 9, he was replaced by Jeff Raymond, and John Marr mentored and trained Jeff Raymond until he left. And when Raymond left, Marr then mentored his successor, Brian Naylor and David Johnston. And then when Naylor left to go over to Channel 9, Marr selected me. He made life pretty well miserable for many of the years that I worked under him, but he had an agenda, and his agenda was to promote me eventually to become a newsreader. Now, up until that stage, newsreaders were game show hosts, they were station presenters, they were radio announcers. They decided to break the rule and appoint a journalist as a newsreader. And that changed the whole scene everywhere. So today, everyone is a journalist, but I happen to be the first at Channel 7. And so that broke the mold. And they promoted me as Mal Walden, will be reading the news tonight. As a journalist, he knows what he's talking about. Well, that infuriated Naylor over at 9, who responded, you don't have to be a journalist to be a good communicator. And he was dead right. You don't have to be a journalist to be a good communicator on television. But it was all this perception of promotion. And then a few weeks later, they launched over at 9, Brian Told Me, you know, that song,
yes, yes.
the real soapy song. So, you know, we are just subjects of a huge organization behind the scenes that promote you. They own you, basically. You know, they'll snap their fingers and you do what they tell you.
So were you and Brian friends at the time when that was happening?
Oh yeah, we were all very close. It was a very closely knit little community in the newsroom. And that's what made it so difficult when you could probably ask me some of the hardest news stories I've ever had to cover. That the first hardest news story that really shook our faith in what we were doing was Balibo in East Timor. And I put my hand up to go and was told to go home and pack a bag. Subsequently, one of the other journalists got the gig, Greg Shackleton. And a week after Greg and cameraman Gary Cunningham and the sound recordist Tony Stewart left, exactly 1 week later, Thursday night, the phone rang and I picked it up and there was a woman on the phone and she was hysterical. She was crying. She was saying, my son is dead. They've killed my son. And I said, I'm sorry, who are you? Who's calling? She said, my name is Mrs. Shackleton. I'm Greg Shackleton's mother. And I said, no, I'm sorry, Mrs. Shackleton. That's totally wrong. We would be the first to hear about it if that had happened. She said, no, it's a mother's intuition. I can tell you it's happened. And I said, look, I'll get management to give you a call, but you are so wrong. It turns out she was quite right. The following day, the news came through. It was not a mother's intuition. It was a mother's terrible premonition.
Wow.
And that was the terrible story of what happened to the guys in Balibo, East Timor. You know, and that shattered our little close-knit news department. And then in 1982, the news helicopter crashed and killed another 4 of our colleagues. So they are the hard type of stories you're faced with when you're reading the news, and you have to be as dispassionate and as you possibly can and in control. With the helicopter crash, which is sudden, I mean, Balibo was a slow process, but before it was confirmed. But the helicopter crash is sudden. You know, every life is going along cheerily 1 minute, and then bang, the bottom falls out of your life. And there's nothing you can do. You just have to face it and do it. And that was the first time I'd ever recorded a news bulletin. We recorded the first break, but we started at 6:15, and it took me 15 minutes before I got it right because we kept on breaking down.
Yeah.
Terrible. And then, of course, you talk about Black Saturday, which happened years later. And you're faced with the terrible situation of Brian, Naylor and Maury being killed in the Black Saturday bushfires and having to read that. So it's not all rosy being a newsreader.
No, and that would be, I mean, that would be very hard being friends with someone and then you're finding it.
Yeah. Well, when you think of all the friends I've lost in the course of my career, it doesn't make it any easier when it happens. And the fact is that on that Black Saturday morning, Brian, David Johnson and I were due to play golf. And if you might remember, there was a heat wave leading up to Black Saturday. And on the Friday, I think we realized it was just going to be too unbearable to play golf. So we canceled. And I went into work, read the early news, came home, and I'd only just got home when my boss rang me to tell me we're having a terrible rumor that Brian and Maury may have been caught up in the fires. And just as he said that, I saw the crawl come across the bottom of the screen on Channel 9's news, and Hitchner announced it. And then, so I rang David Johnson and told him, and he had no idea either. So we're all taken by surprise and all absolutely shocked.
Yeah. Well.
Yes. Well,
There's not much you can say, is there? I mean, it's
it's a tragic loss.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people died, and you have to be very careful that you don't build up one particular person as a victim when there were so many victims of Black Saturday.
Mm.
That's the way I see it, anyway.
Yes, I actually worked on staging during Swallows Juniors, or Brian and the Juniors, as it later became, and a lovely man.
Yeah. No, as I said, we all, David, Brian, and I were the faces of Channel 7 News for, right through the 70s. We were good friends. We mixed socially. Our wives mixed socially. It was very much a tight-knit little community, and it was small. We were only about 7 or 8 of us in the newsroom, so it grew after that. But it just,
Also, one of your first assignments was to cover the devastation of Cyclone Tracy, which ripped through the city on the 25th of December 1974. What are your memories of being on the ground in the aftermath of the cyclone?
Right. Christmas Day, 1974, I came into the newsroom, and on the chalkboard was Cyclone Tracy. It was not the lead story. It was fairly well down in the bulletin. We knew a cyclone had hit Darwin, but we had no idea. All communication was down, so we had no idea just what was happening up there. And I was sent out to do a story on the Salvation Army looking after homeless people in Melbourne on Christmas Day. The time I got back, and we all worked short shifts on Christmas Day, which allowed everyone just to work a few hours, which was perceived to be the best for everyone concerned. And I was the junior. I was a junior reporter. I was still a cadet. And about 2 minutes to 12, I was due to knock off at midday. The boss walked in and he stormed up and down the newsroom saying, "What are we doing about Cyclone Tracy?" And the chief of staff said, "Brisbane are going. Brisbane are covering it." And he snapped, "Brisbane? They're just a bunch of dingbats. We've got to go. We've got to do something about it." He stormed into his office, slammed the door, lit another cigarette. There was always a cloud of smoke hovering over John Marr. And I could see him chain smoking his way. And he stormed out and he said, "We've got to go. We've got to go to Darwin. Okay, who've we got to send?" And the chief of staff said, "Well, we've got David Johnson's reading the news because Brian's on holiday. David Hill, who was a sports reporter at the time, he's gone out. He's on assignment. So is Pam Graham. We've got Mel Walden." And I saw him go, "Oh, shit, isn't there anybody else?" And this is in front of me. And there's deathly silence. Then he stormed across, lit another cigarette, and he said, "Mal," he said, "I'm going to send you to Darwin. This will be the making or breaking of you, son. Don't let me down." And with that threat hanging over me, we took off at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Learjet from Bibb Stillwell out of Essendon. And we flew to Alice Springs, excuse me. And then from Alice Springs, we arrived over Darwin at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And we looked out the window of the jet as we were coming in. At this stage, it was getting a bit bumpy in the tail end of Tracy. And we looked out, and as far as we could see, there was devastation. And it was a bit like looking at a sepia photograph of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bombs. It was just bleak and nothing. You could see where the roads were, and every house, every building was destroyed or partly destroyed. And we touched down, grabbed the equipment. An army guy came up and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "We're going to do a story." He took us in his car to his house, and that was a disaster. And we did a few interviews. Everywhere, it didn't take any skill in getting the story, because everywhere the camera looked, there was devastation. And everyone you spoke to had a story. And then we went back to the airport, which was leaking like a sieve, and all the evacuees were arriving with injuries, clutching Christmas presents, unopened Christmas presents. And we tried to get an interview with General Alan Stratton, who had been placed in charge. And I'd met General Stratton when he formed the Natural Disasters Organization several months earlier. And I spotted him in the crowd, went across and did an interview with him. And he said, "Son, I've got to evacuate this city as from now. Every plane that takes off will be full of evacuees. I've made that decision. I'm in charge. I'm doing that now." So we've got all this on camera. It's a fabulous story. He said, "What are you going to do with the interview?" I said, "I'm sending it back on the Learjet." He said, "There's no way, son, no way that plane's taking off unless it's full of evacuees." Well, if there was one thing I did that day that saved my career, and that voice hanging over my head. This will make you or break you, son. Don't let me down. John Maher. I raced out and grabbed everyone with a bandage and put them on that Learjet. And it was cleared and it took off. We were on the ground for about an hour and a half. We arrived at 6. By 9 o'clock, I stood watching the Learjet take off with the first footage of Cyclone Tracy.
Wow.
Unaware that it was, in fact, the first footage. I just had done my job. I'd sent the story, packaged it up, put it on the plane. And don't forget, it was all film in those days. And the plane took off. And then we tried to find a place to live. And we chose the Travelodge Motel. It wasn't until about 4 or 5 days later, no communication, so I had no idea what was happening back in Melbourne. 4 or 5 days later, a news crew came up to relieve my news crew, or the camera crew, and not me, the camera crew. So, and it was they who told me that our footage arrived back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Essendon Airport. It was whipped off and taken straight to a processing plant, came off the processing editing machine at 28 minutes past 6. Remember, news was at 6:30 in those days. 28 past 6 it came on, just a quick edit, top and tail, stand up, story, interviews. At 6:30 they opened up the satellite links, and that was the first vision the world saw of what had happened in Cyclone Tracy. We beat the ABC by half an hour, but we were first.
Wow, what a process for news to be delivered that way.
Yeah, that's the way it was.
Wow.
And it was terribly difficult to get the story because the humidity up there, they had to change the film in a black bag to put back into the camera, all sight unseen. It was, and then every story I did in the 10 days I was up there, we would race out to the airport after we'd filmed it. And I'd plead with a pilot that was flying to Melbourne with the evacuees, please take this, call Channel 7 when you're an hour out of Melbourne, and that somebody will pick it up. You know, I'm just hoping someone will pick it up. You know, in the 10 days, we never lost a story, and every story met its time frame of 6:30 that night.
Wow.
So it's quite an achievement considering we can't do that these days with all the technology that we have.
And you had no contact, able to ring Channel 7?
Not for the first 5 days. They opened up telephone and we were each allowed, I think, 5 minutes to use that emergency phone. And that's when communications slowly began to open up.
So John was happy then, I take it?
Well, yes, when I got back and walked into the newsroom, he's standing there smoking away, smoke surrounding his face. He said, oh, the traveller's returned, has he? And I said, yes, John, are you happy? He said, oh, read this. And he handed me an envelope. And it was my first grading as a journalist.
Wow.
And then he opened the door, slammed the door shut, and went back in his office and lit another cigarette. Great days. I have great memories. Yeah. And you're reminding me of all this as we progress.
Yeah. Getting to 1987 was the awful news of the Julian Knight, you know, shooting all those people in Clifton Hill, where tragically 7 people died. You actually covered that news that night.
No, I didn't. I covered it from the security of a news desk. I didn't go out in the scene.
Oh, you weren't out there? Okay.
No, but it's funny you should mention it because last weekend, I'm a member of what is called the Survivors Club. And it's all people 70 and over who were in the media, and we all gathered twice a year. And we're sitting talking to a reporter from 3AW, and we're talking about stories we covered. And he was relating the story of the Julian Knight shooting in Hoddle Street. And he said, I just arrived. I got the message at 3AW, and I took the news car out there. And I just got out the car when the first bullet slammed into the car. And I dived to the ground, and then my car was peppered with bullets as he was firing. And I was thinking to myself, my God, that's an amazing story. Who am I going to tell? Well, you guys. Oh. And yeah, so I was thankful that in those days I was covering news basically from the desk. I was no longer a reporter on the road.
Okay.
Who take their life into their own hands so often.
Wow.
27th of March 1987, you were dismissed by the new management of Channel 7 when it was taken over by the Fairfax Group. You were told just minutes before you went to air, and like the true professional you are, you delivered your final bulletin. Can you tell us about that last news program?
Yes, I can. As I mentioned or alluded to a little earlier, Fairfax took over the running of Channel 7 in March that year. They came down en masse, the executives, and were quickly nicknamed the Princes of Darkness by their ruthlessness and their breaching of corporate care. They just sacked people willy-nilly. Well, they made some terrible decisions. They got rid of people, stalwarts, Melbourne icons like, Ron Casey, Bill Collins, Lou Richards, World of Sport. They got rid of the AFL football just weeks before the season began. They made other decisions, and I sort of prepared myself for the inevitable. And it was a Friday afternoon, and a friend of mine had been appointed acting manager because Casey had gone. Jerry Carrington was the finance operator. And I was about to ring him because he'd just been appointed acting manager. I was going to ring him to congratulate him when he rang me. And he said, Mel, have you got a minute? And I said, yeah. He said, we would like to see you in my office. So I had this foreboding of, oh God, this it's going to be me. And it didn't really worry me because it was a terrible place to be working in. So I took a lift up, walked into his office, and all the Sydney executives were sitting around looking at their feet. So I knew something was afoot. Pun. And he said, look, many decisions have been made, and this is perhaps one of my hardest, but you're no longer part of the process going forward. And I just said, oh, that's okay, Jerry, don't worry about it. If you just see my lawyer and just reach a settlement, I'd be quite happy to depart. And you could see the relief come off everybody. Mel, this is very good of you, and if you want to go on a holiday, we'll pay for the holiday. They weren't going to have a scene, and I was not going to make a scene. Got into the lift, it was just on 3 o'clock. And Gordon Bennett was there. I mentioned Gordon Bennett before, head of sport. He said, Mel, is it true what I've just heard? And I said, how did you hear? Because it's only just happened. He said, it's on the news on 3AW, 3 o'clock. The guy that's replacing you is coming over from Perth, and he's announced it in Perth, and it's come through the wire service. So I was told to go down to my office and not talk to anybody. I rang my lawyer, and he said, stay in your office, don't talk to anyone. In that short time, Gordon relayed that Nine had offered me a job. Kennett said he's going to raise it in Parliament. Bruce Ruxton rang to offer his, deepest sympathy. So I sat there thinking, this is an incredible story. But I just sat there quietly. My lawyer rang me back and he said, listen, Mel, he said, they've agreed to let you go. You don't have to host the Royal Children's Hospital and appeal in 3 weeks' time. You can go after tonight, but they want you to read tonight's news. And I thought, well, that's strange. So that's when my boss came and said, you're reading tonight's news, don't say anything, will you? And I said, no, I won't, of course I won't. So when I came to the end of the news bulletin and I read it, once I started, it was just another news bulletin, didn't worry me. I knew I had a job to go to on Monday if I wanted to. So I read the news, and right at the very end, I was given 30 seconds to say my goodbye. And all I said was, look, you've obviously heard that there have been many changes over the last week or so. The latest change involves me. After 20 years, I'm leaving the network. I want to thank you for your support. And at that, I heard someone sob next to me, and it was the sporting presenter. He went, and that shook me. Then I heard the auto cue girl sobbing. And that's when I said, thank you for your support and good night. And I turned. I didn't break down, but I just turned. But that was the front page of the newspaper the following morning of me to Walden breaks down. I didn't actually break down, and I didn't shed a tear. I was sort of caught up in the moment. Then the boss came in and said, listen, Mel, would you come upstairs and just make a speech to the staff because they're pretty shell-shocked? So I made a rousing speech to the staff. By the time I left the station, my wife came down to pick me up and we were going down to the pub for a drink. By the time I walked out with my boxes of goods and everything, and my newsroom suits, which I was going to take with me, there was a protest out in the street. There were placards. All the newspaper journalists were there. And I thought, oh, gee, this is big time. I thought everyone got the sack in television. Oh, well, I'll let it go. Well, then it accelerated. 60 Minutes came down, and Jan Event did a story on it. Kennett did raise it in Parliament. It became a big intercity rivalry thing. I've since heard from my friend Jerry Carrington, who was the finance manager, that Fairfax lost over $600 million in lost revenue because of it. Fairfax and Seven ultimately went into receivership. But the one story that highlights the backlash of public opinion coming in my favor was when my replacement arrived at Tullamarine to take over my job at Channel 7. And he's a lovable guy by the name of Greg Pierce. He said, I got into a taxi and I threw my bags on the back and sat next to the driver so I could sort of chat with him. And the guy said, where are you off to, mate? And he said, I'm going to Channel 7. He said, oh, you work there, do you, mate? And he said, no, I start Monday. He said, oh, what do you do, mate? He said, oh, I'm the new newsreader. He said, the car slowly pulled over to the side of the road. He said, well, bloody well get out here, because I sure as hell, I'm not going to drive you. And he tossed him out on the side of the Tullamarine Freeway. And that was an indication of the public backlash against what was happening by Sydney dictating what Melbourne viewers were to see. It was just a very interesting time. And strangely enough, that, you know, I always thought I might be remembered. My legacy in television news would be perhaps being the first journalist to be appointed as a newsreader, or the first journalist to get a story out of Cyclone Tracy, or whatever. But it seems that my legacy will be that Fairfax takeover and how much it cost that organisation.
Can I tell you a quick story just about?
Yeah, please do.
For a minute, I'm just going to go off script. So, 87, I was 9 or 10 at the time, and I had a few part-time jobs, and one was working in a newsagents in a shopping centre. And I think it was the Friday or the Monday. It was the Friday, and the Herald Sun at the time had 3 to 4 papers come out a day. They had the morning, lunch,
yes, that's right.
afternoon, and then the evening one. And I remember coming to the newsagent, I think it was like 5 or 6 o'clock to do my paper rounds and things. And all these people were like, got the newspapers, you know, walking around like, you know, there was some women had tears in their eyes and men were reading them. And I thought, so someone's died. Like, what's going on? You know, because there's just people everywhere reading. And then I get in and straight away the owner of the newsagents, come here, young man, come here. You got to read this news. Come. And it was your sacking, and
right.
It was just such like it shocked everyone. I mean, even as a child, because we had you on the news every night, and it was like.
I will add a little addendum to that, because when we all adjourned down to the pub for a few drinks, and then drove home, and I got home, and my front veranda was full of flowers, chocolates, wine. And it was as if I had died. Yeah. And we had twins. We had they're toddlers. And Pauline said, would you go around to the 7-Eleven and get some nappies? We've run out of nappies. So I got in the car and drove around there, and I walked in, and there was a huddle around the till, and there were 2 ladies crying. And I thought, wow, it must have been robbed. So I've sidled up to find out what's happened. And I heard the lady say, and he's got 2 twins. I mean, I suddenly realized that they were talking about me. And that is when it first hit me, that it was more than just a sacking, that it was, in fact, a very significant event in the lives of so many people. And it paid dividends for me, because I went across to Channel 10 and started Mal's Melbourne. And then Channel 10 went into receivership a few years later. And I remember going to the chief of the news boss and saying, look, how safe am I? Because they're just shedding staff left, right, and center. And he said, mate, he said, you're on the list of the receivers and you're on the bottom of the list. The receivers have given us instructions that you are never to be sacked after what happened at Channel 7. I became a protected species for the rest of my career, simply based on the backlash that occurred when I left Seven.
It was,
Even though it was a long time ago, I was only the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't my sacking that caused all that. I was just happened to be the last one.
wow. And even the next day, the news agents, they used to have the A4 posters in that steel cages sitting out the front, and the whole shop was just photos of you.
Yeah. Interesting. They were interesting times, and I don't think it'll ever happen again. But it was interesting to be a part of it, a part of that history.
Did they ever say why they got rid of you? Or?
No, I think, well, they did. And I've done interviews and I've written all about this. I've chronicled it in my my memoir. And there are far more details in my memoir, The Newsman, that includes the interviews with Sydney station management and why they did it and everything. It's just a little bit too hard to go into all the detail now. But yeah. They just wanted a new broom to sweep clean, basically, and get rid of anything. And a lot of it was invective in just wanting to amend the hostility between Fairfax, ATN, Sydney, and HSV7 Melbourne.
Yeah. So 1 month after the Channel 7 saga, you joined Eyewitness News team at Channel 10 as a reporter and a presenter of the segment Mel's Melbourne, presenting human interest stories. So how did you get the job at Channel 10? You obviously
Well, again, you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know. I had an offer from 9, then I had an offer from 10, and 10's offer was not quite as financially rewarding as 9's. So I hung out until 10 matched the 9 offer, and that took a few days. And then I went across to 10. It was. And I worked with David. David and I were very good mates, and he and the news producer devised this segment called Mal's Melbourne, which was a feel-good series of stories about life, the battlers of Melbourne, and I just loved it. I mean, I had 3 years, just fantastic. But a short time later, at Channel 10, Jo Pearson, who was reading with David, left with her husband, Rob Gell, to go over to Channel 9. So David rang me that morning. He said, how about you and I read the news? 2 males. And I said, oh, well, okay. So he and I read the news for quite some months. And the ratings went up and up and up. And we hit 1 million a night. Wow. 1 million viewers a night. And we posted a full-page ad in the paper. Thanks a million, Melbourne. And it was just absolutely incredible. But then they hired Tracy Cura, and Tracy came down, and they had 3 newsreaders, and 3 newsreaders on the desk, plus the sporting guy, plus the weather guy, plus Peter Costigan, who did political comments. It looked like a Royal Children's Hospital appeal desk. And so, and then we went into receivership, and they shed all the staff, and Tracy became a victim of the staff cutting. We were left with such a short, small skeleton staff that we couldn't compete at 6, so they decided to put us on at 5. And that was a whole new ball game of news at 5. And then throughout the early 90s, it picked up in popularity, David reading the news. And then in 75, I think it was, in 95, David got an offer from 7, and he went back to 7, and I took over. That's basically how all that happened.
Wow.
Dear old I Missed It News.
I Missed It News, yes. Poor old 10. They had some troubling times, and they still have troubling times. It's very, very sad.
1996, David Johnson announced his return to Channel 7, and you took on the role of chief news presenter, once again delivering the 10 news at 5 alongside Jennifer Hansen and later Helen Kapelos. Do you know why David went back to Channel 7?
Yeah, I do. Again, Channel 10 news in the early 90s, we'd come out of receivership, we were building it up. And they appointed a new news director by the name of Carmel Travers. And Carmel turned out to be a disaster for a lot of people at 10. She was just sacking people variously across the whole network, and made life miserable for quite a few people in the news department. And David said, I can't continue under this. And he had an offer from Seven, so he decided to take it. And the irony of that is the following day they sacked Carmel Travers, but it was too late. By that stage, David had gone, and I'd been appointed the newsreader, so with Jen Hansen. Jen and I became the longest serving newsreader duo on Channel 10's, in Channel 10's history.
What was it like presenting with someone rather than solo? You've been on Channel 7.
Yeah, no, I had no difficulty about that at all. No difficulty with that at all. You know, the directors tell you which camera to look at and what story to read next, and we had a nice little rapport, Jen and I. It was just unfortunate that 10 years later she decided to pursue other endeavours, and she left, and Helen Kapelos joined us. And then Helen was a delight to work with as well. It's a bit like a marriage when you work closely with someone. You mix socially, you share stories, and you share you might not always agree on the stories we're reading at the time, and we've had some heated arguments on the desk about, you know, political arguments. But, you know, as soon as the floor manager says, stand by, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, that all stops and you go back into it. But there's some very funny moments behind the scenes, which I can't really go into at this stage.
Was there much notable difference between Channel 7 and Channel 10, or was there the usual chaos in the control room?
No. There was no difference between 7 and 10. In fact, half the people that I was working with at 10 had worked at Channel 7, and that just came out. It was a bit like changing departments. I knew everybody. No, there was no difference at all. Stories were the same. And I think at that stage, the only difference was the time, and news on 7 was at 6:30 still. And we were at 6, and we were an hour and they were only half an hour. But that soon changed, and all the other networks went for an hour as well. It's a bit follow the leader-ish, isn't it?
I must ask, how is David? Do you still speak to David now?
Oh, yeah. You know, after 53 years in media, you'd think you'd have a host of contacts and friends. But I've got about 3 from the industry. There's David, Gordon Bennett, and my former boss at news director, Dermot O'Brien. So there are not many that I keep in touch with. They've all gone off and done their own thing. But we as a trio have kept together.
Yeah. Ken?
What was it like presenting news with a co-host and not solo?
Yeah, well, as I said, you know, it hasn't, it was no different. It was, the director tells you what to read, and you pre-read your script. My problem with, I went back to being a solo reader towards the end of my career because everyone had been sacked. And so for the last 3 or 4 years, I was reading by myself. And then we went into a new news format, an ill-fated format headed by George Negus on 10, and that didn't work. So we went back to being solo newsreaders again. So the last 3 years I read by myself. And because we had so few in the staff in the newsroom, the news was being written as I was reading it. So I was going sight unseen most nights reading the news. I'd finish my story and then hand in the next story. So there was no preparation. And this went on, and I'm thinking, oh, this was terrible. I mean, I'll give you an example of the cost cutting. On the day 6 months before I left, there were 57 people in that Channel 10 newsroom. On the day I left, there were only 6. So that gives you an indication of the severity of the staff cutting that went on under Lachlan Murdoch in that time.
Yeah.
And there is another story. Lachlan Murdoch. How far does the acorn fall from the oak tree?
1997 was the year of the tragic loss of Princess Diana. I believe you'd met her. What was it like covering the news of the death of the people's princess?
Oh, well, it was devastating. I mean, it was such a shock. I'd met Princess Diana and Prince Charles during a press gathering at Government House. And we were told that they would be arriving shortly. They would come around to the various groups, and whatever was said was to be kept just between us. So there was a deathly silence in the news in Government House when Princess Di arrived. She had that charisma. What we didn't know, that Prince Charles had been in the room for about 20 minutes. There'd been no reaction whatsoever. Anyway, they walked around and they came to our little group. And I'll never forget Prince Charles saying to Clem Dimsey, he said, Clem, I seem to remember you last time I was here. You had a horse called whatever it was. It came third. Bit of a disappointment. How's it going now? And Clem was taken aback. Wow, you're very observant. He said, oh, I've got another one now, and it's called so. Anyway, when Prince Charles left with his little group to go over to the Channel 9 group, I heard his equerry saying, we're now approaching the Channel 9 newsroom. The tall blonde guy is the reader. His name is Brian Naylor. And he was briefing him as he was walking. So he's able to walk up and say, oh, Brian, nice to see you. And we all thought, that's fantastic. Anyway, we're in the group and Princess Di came up. Now, Pauline and I had just returned from a holiday in Queensland with the twins. And I think they were 3 or 4 and they had run havoc in the plane. We just couldn't control them. So my first question to Princess Di was, she asked me whether I had children. I said, yeah, twins, and we've just come back from a holiday. I said, can I ask you, how do you cope with Harry and William? And she said, oh, quite well. I just doped them up with Finnegan. And I've gone, oh, because we were considering using Finnegan to calm them down, but she called it Finnegan, but she meant Finnegan. And I could hardly wait to get home to my wife and say, Finnegan has been given the royal stamp of approval. She said, the only problem is with William, I think it was, with William, it made him a bit hyper, so we had to cut the dose down a bit. But she was so open and so frank, and those sparkling blue eyes, she was a delight. So her death came as a personal shock as well as a news shock.
Must have been an amazing moment to meet her, though.
Well, it was. I mean, yeah, I mean, when you see somebody regularly on your television every night, and you actually get to meet them, and they live up to all expectations, it's a good feeling.
Yeah. Now there's a funny clip of you on YouTube presenting the news, and everyone was talking in the background, and your comment was, "Would you please shut up for Christ's sake? I'm on the air." Now, what was going on that night? What was happening there?
Well, it wasn't night. It was a mid-afternoon. I was doing a news update, and there's a bit of a lesson in this because I did lose my cool, and I did yell out, as you said, for Christ's sake, shut up, can't you see I'm on air? Because 2 of the journalists were arguing in the background. And as they were arguing, I was raising my voice doing the update to try and drown them out. And the louder I came, the louder they argued. So it was like a competition between who could shout the loudest. And that's when I lost it and I snapped at them. But the moral to that story is be careful who you shout at, because one of those journalists turned out to be my boss, Dermot O'Brien, in future years. So there's a little lesson in that.
Well, it was a funny clip. It's got a lot of views. Now we covered the
probably more views than on YouTube than on the night. Afternoon.
Now you also had a $8 million defamation lawsuit against you. Can you tell us about that, or is it we can't?
No, I can tell you about that. It was Christmas Eve, approaching Christmas. I can't even remember the year. I think it was about 70, 77. Before I was reading the news. Our landlord had evicted his tenants in a boarding house in South Melbourne. And I went out to cover all the tenants on the nature strip with all their belongings strewn around. And I did 2 stand-ups. One was quite defamatory, so I did another. Well, the obvious happened. I went back to the station and they sent me out on another job, and whoever put the story together put the defamatory stand-up in. And of course, he claimed that he was attacked in the street after he was recognized. And he then claimed that his house burnt down as part of the retribution. In the house, he claimed he had a Rembrandt, And he backed that up with a documentary the ABC had aired about a year earlier, showing that he did, in fact, have a Rembrandt that was inherited. So he wanted to sue for $8 million. The problem was, and he was in his 70s, the problem was he couldn't find a lawyer to stand by him. So he went to university and he did a course in defamatory law. And he came back several years later and issued the writ again, defending himself. And it went to the Supreme Court. And we had a QC, the same QC that defended the captain of the ship which hit the Hobart Bridge. And this was like a very costly QC. And I remember sitting in his office and he said, "I'm going to brief you, Mr. Walden." He said, "I've been watching commercial television news for the first time in my life, and you guys get away with murder." And I'm thinking, oh, so I said, "So we're not going to win?" He said, "Highly unlikely we're going to win this." And I'm thinking, oh my God. And he said, "And this is what you do." And he gave me instructions and what to say. And so the following morning I've appeared in the Supreme Court. He's come out with his little beanie on and he's called the judge, his worship, his lordship, his honor. He called him everything. And he said, "Just call me your honor, that'll do." And he said, so he defended himself. It lasted 6 days in the Supreme Court. And what we were scared of, it was going to look a bit like a David and Goliath court case of the Herald and Weekly Times versus this pensioner defending himself in this $8 million lawsuit. Anyway, went right down to the wire. And on the final day, the jury went out. They came back about 2 hours later and found not guilty. I was not guilty. So that was a lesson in law, a lesson for all of us to be a little careful with what we put to air. Yeah, so it was a defamation case that we were very thankful for the media missed. We do not know how they missed it, because it was a great David and Goliath story. Yeah. But I was just establishing myself as a newsreader on Channel 7. It was the last thing I needed. And fortunately, I didn't get it. I didn't get any adverse publicity whatsoever.
Wow. Amazing.
Didn't happen on June the 6th, did it?
No, it didn't. No, not on June the 6th. No.
Now, we did speak about the hardest news story you had to deliver, which was a question for Ken, but we'll move on to Brian Naylor, who was the chief newsreader on Channel 9 from 78 to 98. And we know that you were friends now. So what was Brian like?
Well, Brian was a great guy. I mean, he was the consummate professional. And he was very conscious of that, and he protected his image. And I can't say much more about it. I mean, we were good friends. We had a very tenuous time, particularly during the 80s when he was at 9 establishing himself. I was at 7 establishing myself. And by then, David Johnson was on 10 establishing himself. And a lot of stories that were coming out in the press, Brian took offense to. In fact, I think he tried to sue David over one of them. It was unpleasant for a period of time, but then we got used to it and we became good friends again. Yeah. We try not to let the egos get in the way of a history of friendship, which we did. And we, as I said, we were due to play golf on that terrible Black Saturday and cancelled the day before, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
The current American news stations, do you ever watch them, and what do you think of the style of presenting?
Look, I can't really add very much to that. I do watch occasionally. They're very, very professional, perhaps a little more professional than we are. But other than that, and the barrel is far bigger to choose their talent from in the United States. And a lot of that talent is very well trained, well versed in law, politics from university days. Their educational system is fantastic in the States. So there's a lot to choose from. And I admire most of them. And you'll find quite a few Australians working over there, particularly on CNN. So it's good to see that they think pretty much the same as a number of Australian journalists. You know, they're good.
This might be this might be a strange question, but we hear different stories of newsreaders, what they wear. beneath the desk, underneath, sorry, shorts, underwear, but they got the suit tie and jacket on. We always
Well, Matt, I can tell you, we all wear underwear.
yeah.
Look, the studios are so air conditioned that if you go in with shorts, the chances are you're going to freeze your legs off. I mean, sure. I mean, I wore jeans and chinos and just a suit jacket.
Yep.
It's quite funny. I'll tell you a little story about the wardrobe. I used to walk in to my wardrobe department and pick up, hanging in the wardrobe, all with my suits for the week. And pinned to the corner, pinned to my elbow, would be a little ticket saying Mal News Monday, Mal News Tuesday, Mal News Wednesday. And it would be a matching tie to coordinate with whatever my co-reader was wearing. And there was one day I went during lunch break, I stepped across to the bank and I was in a queue at the bank. And there was a tap on the shoulder and I turned around and she said, "It's Mal, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "It's Tuesday, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes." And she pointed and I'd walked out with the label still stuck. So I had done 2 or 3 news updates with my label, Mal Monday, Mal Tuesday, whatever the day was on my. So I learned that little lesson.
Amazing. What advice would you give a young person who wants to become a journalist or work on the news on TV or in radio?
I would say have an inquiring mind. Listen to what is being said when you're asking the questions. Don't be afraid to question. And don't overact while you're on television. None of these false smiles or false crocodile tears, because the camera accentuates every mood and every impression. You don't have to overact. And sadly, a lot are doing that. And I sit and I watch and think, oh, you know, you don't have to overreact. But have an inquiring mind and listen to what is being said.
Yeah. Now, during your career, did you ever have any control over the stories that you were delivering? Was there ever a story that you didn't want to deliver, or you were able to sort of say to the boss, not doing that one?
Well, it's not up to a newsreader to editorialize. However, there were many times when I disagreed with stories, that I just read them because that is the role of a newsreader. I improvised many times. My life is on Google. My improvisations are on YouTube. They're all out there to be looked at and to be cringed over. But only once did it ever get me into trouble. And it involved a throw to a commercial break after a story that I was totally opposed to about an airline hostess who had a fling with Ralph Fiennes, the actor,
yes.
in the Mile High Club. And about 6 weeks later, she launched her lingerie set. And I said to the chief of staff, "This is not a news story." And she said, "We're instructed to run it from Sydney." And I said, "That is," and I had this great blazing row. Anyway, they ran it. She said, "I'll cut it back." Well, she did cut it back, but she played the wrong one. The editor played the wrong one. They played the lengthy one, which was, it ran for about 3 minutes. And I'm sitting at the desk and she could see me fuming. So the director cut it midstream. And they cut back to me and I said, "Well, we'll throw to a commercial break now in the hope that our next story is not a waste of time like that last one." And I heard a gasp go up from the studio floor. And I thought, oh, well, you know, I said worse things in my time. And I walked into the newsroom afterwards and all the phones were ringing, all the newspapers are on, and the headlines are following, and Walden has a brain snap. Yeah, only people that came to my defense was Media Watch. But I got a bollocking from senior management. And we, you know, I put my case very, very firmly with not quite as many expletives as he did, but we screamed at each other for about 3 minutes. And then he said, "Okay, I'm not going to win this," he said, "but in a few years' time, we may look back and laugh." And I said, "I doubt it." And I walked out and slammed the door, and that was it. And it's never been mentioned since.
Wow. Lisa Robertson was her name. I remember that. Lisa Robertson was her name, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, very good.
There've been plenty of changes in television, but over the years. But do you have a one memory of a big change in TV from then to now? Colour?
Well, I don't know whether you mean technically or in big news stories. I'm often asked what have been the biggest news stories I've covered. I always say news stories are a bit like hit songs. You always remember where you were when you first heard them.
Yeah.
I mean, JFK, the assassination, Man on the Moon, Cyclone Tracy was particularly important to me. The deaths of my colleagues in Ballabo and the deaths of Elvis, John Lennon. We've touched on the death of Princess Di. But the biggest story, a story that changed all our lives, was September 11. And that was a television news story. That is until the pandemic and COVID-19. But by the time that had broken out, I'd moved on and I've left that to others to report. But I think the pandemic would have to be the biggest story in our lifetime.
Yeah.
As for the other change I started when auto cues were just beginning to be invented. Otherwise, we read hard copy and we looked up, we memorized a line, we looked down, memorized the next line, read that. We didn't need auto cue, but you delivered slower because of it. And you could emphasize more because you were not reading parrot fashion off an auto cue. David Johnson thinks the worst thing that ever happened was the invention of the auto cue. But of course that sped things up and it made it that anyone could come in and read the news to a degree of efficiency. Then of course, we went from typewriters to computers, and then we went from coaxial cable delivery to satellite delivery, and now we've entered the digital era, and there's there's so many platforms of news now that the technology has been the driving force right from the very beginning. As I said earlier, the actual news services have not changed very much. Stories are the same. We're still doing exactly the same stories, but the technology that's driving and enabling us to deliver those stories, that has changed. That's the biggest change.
Yeah. What was a slow news day in the studio like?
Very slow. Very slow. And there were many stories, many slow days. But you've got to remember, we have coming into that station, every station, a streaming process from CNN and the ABC, NBC, BBC. There's never going to be a shortage of news because it's coming from around the world. And we have, half a dozen journalists that are out on the road covering, car crashes, chasing ambulances, fires. There's always something. There's never a day when nothing happens. Might be slow news days, but there's never a day when nothing happens.
A typical day for you at Channel 10, for instance, presenting the 5 p.m. news, what time would you arrive at the studio? And tell us, please, some things that you would have to do before you go to air.
Okay, well, typical day at Channel 10 in the last few years, I would come in at 10 o'clock in the morning and go immediately to a briefing with the Chief of Staff and be told, this is the rundown, these are the prospective stories we'll be looking at, and this is how we'll be covering them. And what happened, the process was the journalists would come back from covering the story, would put their story, give their story to a producer. The producer would write the intro or sub the intro from the journalist. Then it would go to the main producer for approval. And then she would send it to me for, as she would say, so I could put it into Mal speak. So it would suit my style of delivery. So the update, I'd come in at 10, be briefed. 11 o'clock would be my first news update. I would have to write that. I'd have to edit the film, the tape, the vision. And I did that all in my office on computer. I learned how to edit. So I would do my news update, edit the pictures, and go up at 11 o'clock, read it, and then go straight back to my news desk in my office to prepare the next one at 12. So by 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm absolutely exhausted. I could hardly see because I've been concentrating on the computers. It was flat chat. So then I'd have about half an hour break and I'd have a cup of coffee, bit of a chat with some of the staff. Then 4:30, I'd go down to the makeup department, get a bit of makeup on, go 4:45, go into the studio. They would do a color balance of the suits and the ties with whatever my co-reader was wearing. Then we adjourn for 10 minutes and I'd go into the control room and chat with the director. And that was the highlight of the day for me, because we would talk absolute rubbish and we'd have a fabulous communique with the director and the assistant sound operator, and it was just fun. It was and that relaxed me to the point of being able to go into the studio at 3 minutes to 5 and read the news.
See, people would know that you've been there a whole day before you come on. You're not just coming in at 4:30 and then going.
Oh, no. Those days vanished with Brian Naylor way back in 1978. Now, once they made the point that I was a journalist, not just a newsreader, they heaped a whole lot of extra work on my shoulders.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Now, we covered the Ash Wednesday stories and the 9/11. So I will move over to, now it's noted that you have 53 diaries in your garage.
All right.
Days recorded.
Let me tell you, I'll tell you about that and what I'm doing now. When I first started work at 3YB Warnhall, when I left Lee Murray said to me, Mal, when you get down there, you're going to get hit by information overload. I suggest you write things down at the end of the day, just so you can always cover yourself in case someone contradicts what you've done or said. And it gives you an indication of what you've learned. So at the end of each shift, I would write a highlight, a reaction, and an observation. Just 3 points in a diary. I kept that habit for 53 years. Wow. I kept 53 diaries. And it was only, in the last 15, 12 years when we were moving house, Pauline said, what are you going to do with all those diaries? So I started going through them. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic, because it traced not only my life, but also how media had evolved in that time. So those 53 diaries became the genesis of my book, The Newsman. And that was published in, I think, 2015, after I'd left. Then the publisher said, have you got any other books in you? And I said, oh, it's taken me 53 years to write this. On that basis, neither of us are going to be around for the next. And he gave me advice. He joined me up with the State Library of Victoria, gave me a code number. I go into the State Library and I can go right through their archives and find out various stories and write about these stories. So he said, your next book will be good stories that shaped Melbourne. So that was my second book. And he said, now listen, I want another book. What about a book of quotes that inspired you because you spent your life delivering bad news? What uplifting quotes can you think of? So I then collected a whole series of quotes, inspired quotes, and the book was called Don't Piss in My Pocket and Tell Me It's Raining, which is all about faint praise, of course. But it was just one of those little quotes that people threw at me many, many times over the years. Then after that came crime, or the crims I had met. And I've met a few, including the most notorious of all, who became my unofficial protector for most of my career in Chopper Reed. And then he said, anyway, to cut a long story short, since I've retired, I've written 10 books. Wow. In fact, while we were speaking, a little ping came up on my computer to say my publisher has accepted my latest book, which will come out next year. That'll be
congratulations.
Yeah. So it's an ongoing thing. It's just been, and there's no better time to write a book than in lockdown, because what else are you going to do? So I've had a very fulfilling, probably I've achieved more in the last 10 years than I did in the 53 years I was on media. So out of those 10 books, 2 were children's books, which I self-published and gave to my grandchildren. There's two that Simon and Schuster have on their shelves, which may or may not see the light of day, but according to my little message that came through a few moments ago, the next book, my 6th through Brolga Publishing, is due out next year. So that's what I've been doing. That's my busy time.
Do you enjoy writing, obviously?
Yeah, I do. I think I've come to the end now, but it's been fantastic. It's been very satisfying. It's a lot of research, more research than actual writing, but I've enjoyed it and I've learned an awful lot. And it's amazing what life can throw. My wife has a little saying, when one door closes, it's amazing what will fly in through the window. And that's been the way of my life. Things have flown in.
On the 6th of June. Just going back for a second, you just mentioned Chopper Read. Did you say he was you knew him well?
Okay. Can we finish on this one? When I first took over the news, reading when after Brian left, Chopper Read wrote to me saying, "Dear Mal," he said, "I'm wondering whether you could do me a favor. I've watched you read the news and you seem a decent enough guy. My dad is about to celebrate his 70th birthday and I want to send a photo of him, but unfortunately I've mutilated my face. And I'm wondering whether you've got any pictures in your library of me before I did this." So I went to the library and found a photo of Chopper with his ears intact and sent them off. A week later, he wrote back. He said, "Dear Mal," he said, "you're one of the few people in this world that's ever done me a favor. And if ever you need any favors, no matter where, no matter when, you just let me bloody well know." He said, "I am your unofficial protector." And he kept in touch right up to the days prior to his death.
Wow.
Which was coincidentally the time I retired. So it all fell into place rather nicely.
Now, before we go, Ken's got one final question.
Yes, we'd like to hear you say phenomenon.
As I said earlier, my life is on Google, my mistakes are on YouTube, and more people have seen that blooper than I saw it on the night. But it is phenomenal or phenomenon. I can say it quite clearly and without any hesitation whatsoever. But I must let a little addendum to that. I saw the word coming up and I had trouble in rehearsal. And I thought, if I have trouble reading it, I'm going to have a bit of fun with it. So it was not totally unprepared for, but I had a bit of fun with it.
Yeah, that's great.
As Graham Kennedy used to say, the best ad-libs are the rehearsed ad-libs.
Yes, exactly.
That was an absolute honor to speak with you, Mel, and to learn about your life and your career. It's amazing. Your career is just, out of this world.
Thank you very much. It's a bit like sitting in a psychiatric's office and a psychiatrist's office. I've just gone through a whole lot of therapy here. So thank you very much.
I hope it was okay.
Yeah.
Anything to finish off with, Ken?
You are going to be signing some books for us.
Oh, yes. Yeah. This is the book?
Yes.
Great.
Now, I've got quite a few. So you let me know what you want me to do with them and how we can get rid of them. And I've got about 20, I think, or between 15 and 20.
I think we'll sell all of them.
They're a collector's item because only a limited number of these books were ever published.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was my first attempt at researching. And that was a good little exercise. I enjoyed that very much.
We'll be able to sell them, and especially being signed, I'm sure they'll all sell. So that'll be great.
Okay.
That was episode 1 of Talking Prisoner Presents, our first episode. Thank you for watching. If you could please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share our videos where you can. Please also like our Facebook page. This episode of Talking Prisoner Presents is also available across all podcast platforms, including Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeartRadio, and all the rest of them, and also on the talkingprisoner.com website. Thanks, Mel. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, guys. I've really enjoyed it. As I said, good therapy. Thank you.
Thank you.